Today, I'll do a lecture on Rabindranath Tagore's The Gardener. Um, this is a poem I did not know at all. I had never read before. Uh, I read it for our class, and so I, in part, wanted to do a lecture on something that I didn't know as well, so you could watch me sort of work my way through the poem itself. And it turns out, of course, that this is an extraordinary poem by an extraordinary man, and I'm really glad that I got to read it. It's a little embarrassing to me that my education, my whole life, has never introduced me to this poet because he is quite extraordinary. So let's start with it actually should not be in quotation marks because this is a longer poem. Our editor, so while I love our editor for introducing this poem to me, to all of us, I really resent that he did not make clear that this is part of a book length poem. I just put the cover art on one of the versions that Amazon had. That's what you see at the right here. But it's 85 sections, and we're reading section 28. I feel like our editor should have made that really clear to us. I think that's a disservice to us. This is only one part of a much larger poem. And this is, one source told me, the second bullet was that it was published in 1913 at the same time as a collection of spiritual poems called the Gitanjali. I just said it in a French way. I have no idea how you'd say it in Bengali. um, and I think the Gitanjali was actually published in 1912. My sources are different. The poems in The Gardener, while published in 1913, were actually written much earlier. But the publication of the two of these led to Tagore receiving the Nobel Prize in Literature. So one of the reasons I think he's such an extraordinary author. He won the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prize sometimes, gets it wrong, doesn't always recognize the best writer ever, but it is a prestigious prize nonetheless and something to pay attention to. I don't think if you read Nobel Prize winners, you'll go wrong. I think this is a good litmus test for a good writer. So again, I read the poem and think it's just absolutely gorgeous and so beautiful and enjoyed it very much. But I also, after reading it a few times, I went and tried to find out a little bit more about this person because, again, I had never heard of this person at all. And so this is just one quote I found. So the Banglapedia, the National Encyclopedia of Bangladesh, um, actually has an entire, he is sort of the center of their modern poetry. If people wrote pre-Tagore and post-Tagore, because he's so, so important, and their description of him is kind of true. He just wrote everything, right? He's primarily known, as the last sentence says, as a poet, but and won the Nobel Prize as a poet. But he was a painter. He composed songs. He created schools where children could be educated. He was part of the social reform that pushed for independence from England. He was born into a wealthy family, and so he had a lot of privilege, which explains a lot. He and used that privilege as he became more and more aware to sort of fight for the rights of common people. And he, one of the other things I find extraordinary, I don't know if he did the translation that we have of this poem from Bengali, but he could. Critics said that his English was as good as his native tongue. I find that extraordinary. As someone who's tried to learn other languages, I sort of am blown away by anyone who can do their own translations. In fact, what I thought with his poem was that when someone did the translation, it turned into something very different, meaning it turned into the form that we see now, but it seems like that is not necessarily the case. So let's talk a little bit about form. I don't think this is the first prose poetry that we have seen, but it is some of the first. So, in general poetry, um, in fact, the poetry that we read at the beginning that looked like prose, meaning it didn't have these, specific meters and rhyme structures, a lot of the reason we see it that way is because they were translations. This is a translation also, but when he translated it, he put it into prose. And as this quote in Poetry for Students explains, this was a controversial decision that changes the style and content of each poem. And then this goes on to describe the value of a prose poem, right? And how it looks different from other kind of poetry, um, and the advantage of a prose poem. So I'm going to skip midway through this quote. Authors use blocks of prose description to develop concrete, complete ideas. Poetry, on the other hand, often proceeds in a non-linear fashion using fragments, right? So when he uses this in his poetry, he's trying to be more linear in his thinking, I think, while still recording impressions. So he's trying to use both. This quote is what an author, again, poetry for students doesn't have authors. It's just written by a group of people, apparently. But this group wrote about a specific poem numbered 60. And remember, we're reading in the another collection of poetry, but we're reading number 28 in the Gardener. So, but what they're saying here about Tagore's decision to write in prose, I think applies to the poem we're reading also. So, very interesting. The form is very different. You really can't talk about meter and rhythm and rhyme in this poem at all. So, instead, you do have to talk about what does the prose, what effect does it have on the poetry? And I think this quote sort of summarizes very well the effect overall. Prose poetry is yeah, it's as you can see. I hope you can see the difference for yourself. So the topic of this poems in general are love, right? The Gardener, the entire all 85 sections in general are love poems, though not completely, and it talks about lots of other things too. But critics believe that this poem about love, really, the beloved that they speak to is really all of humanity. It's not just one lover to another, right? That's not one person who loves someone. The last two lines of the poem, I think most clearly state his meaning. The last two lines are, its pleasure and pain are boundless, and endless its wants and wealth. It is as near to you as your life, but you can never wholly know it. I think that is trying to say that love is so big, and I'm using a very common word on purpose, but that it's so big and so vast and so overwhelming and larger than anything we know or feel or understand that we can never wholly know it. I think that's what he's trying to say here about this topic of love. Let's talk about a few of the poetic elements that he does use that we might be familiar with. One I don't think we've talked about, but it's really clearly here in the poem. It's this repetition of the if it were only, right? Repeated 4 times. So let's look at the first two. If it were only a gem. So let me pause and say it's not clear what the it is. The it comes down 2 lines later when it says it is a heart, right? Meaning I think the it is, and the heart represents love. So if love were only a gem, right? And then if it were only a flower, if it were only a moment, if it were merely a pain, right? All these things, if it were these things, these are comparisons that illustrate that what it is not. It's comparing it to finite things, very small things that you could maybe get your hand around, your head around, your heart around, more metaphorically. And the speaker is rejecting this. In fact, he says in the 2 times he repeats, but it is. And so instead of if it were this, but it is a heart, my beloved, right? Instead, or but it is love, my beloved. It's not those things, it's something bigger, right? Something much bigger. And as I note here in the second bullet, that is repeated only twice, I think to emphasize the uh, the fact that the concreteness, it defies concreteness, right? So just in more general terms, you cannot describe it that way. So one of the things this leads me to believe is the relationship between the speaker and the beloved is unequal, right? The speaker is speaking to this beloved, calling her queen, so I'm going to assume male to female, but I don't know that we can assume that. The speaker knows and understands something the beloved doesn't, right? You're wrong. If it were this, I could explain this to you here. So, because we start the whole poem, your questioning eyes are sad, right? They seek to know my meaning. You want to understand what I'm talking about. I've tried to make this very clear. That's what line 2 is. I have laid myself bare, and because I've laid myself bare, this contradiction in the poem. I probably should have made a whole slide about that, these contradictions that he creates. It's because I have tried to lay myself bare that you cannot. That is why you know me not. So the speaker seems unequal. It's an unequal relationship. And so, as my question here on this bullet point says, is it because this is, um, so the relationship is unequal. So I posit some possible reasons why it is unequal. Is it because the speaker's love is unrequited, right? The speaker speaks to you, the one I love, and you don't understand it, and it's because you don't feel the same way. You have never felt the kind of love I have. So either it's unrequited, meaning you don't love me back, or I love you so much more deeply than you've ever understood me, than you have ever felt, right? Those are kind of condescending ways. Or I say, is it because the speaker is more wise? That's another possibility. It's just an older, more experienced person, maybe not even older, just more experienced. But even that suggests an unequal relationship that seems, maybe at least to modern ears, unhealthy. And so, if, as posited earlier, and this was not my idea, but from the critic's idea, that though he's writing to a woman, the woman becomes all of humanity, then, as my last bullet point here is, the beloved is all of humanity. And a wise person, is sort of trying to suggest to all of us, everyone, that you can't make love finite. It is vast, it is big, it is um, as near to us as, what is the last line said? It is as near to you as your life. So love is as close as your life, but maybe because of that, we can never wholly understand it. So this use of repetition is very effective at expressing this meaning. I also wanted to just quickly look at those symbols and metaphors. I just wrote down a few of the symbols, but all of the things that he says, if it were, right? If it were just a gem, well, what else could a gem mean, right? What are some meanings of that word that might emphasize what the speaker is trying to convey? What does a flower represent? What does a heart represent? And then the heart, even in this poem, becomes almost a metaphor, right? Because the heart, in line 5, it actually says of the heart, it is a heart. And where are its shores and its bottom, right? That becomes a metaphor, comparing it to the ocean, which again is trying to describe its vastness. That's what metaphors do. They show the compare two things that are unlike, so you can better understand how big something is. So that's what I think the heart is doing here in this metaphor. So this is a gorgeous poem from Tagore, and I'm glad we got to read it. These are some of my thoughts as I was reading it to better understand what Tagore was trying to argue.